Private Jake Martinez had been at Fort Bragg for exactly 6 weeks when he decided he'd had enough of Lieutenant Thompson's training methods. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the parade ground as the young recruit watched his fellow soldiers struggle through another punishing drill session. Sweat dripped from his forehead, mixing with the dust that seemed to coat everything on the base. Lieutenant Thompson stood at the edge of the training area, his weathered face showing no emotion as he watched the recruits stumble through their exercises. The man appeared to be in his late 40s, though his graying hair and the deep lines around his eyes suggested he might be older. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. But there was something about his demeanor that rubbed Jake the wrong way. "Move it, Martinez." Thompson's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "My grandmother could crawl faster than you're moving. And she's been dead for 20 years. Jake gritted his teeth and pushed himself harder, his muscles burning as he low-crawled under the razor wire. This wasn't the first time Thompson had singled him out, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. The lieutenant seemed to take particular pleasure in making Jake's life miserable, always finding new ways to criticize his performance or heap additional duties on his shoulders. After the morning drill concluded, the exhausted recruits were given a brief water break before moving on to weapons training. Jake slumped against a concrete barrier, gulping down water from his canteen while trying to catch his breath. His friend Tommy Chen, a skinny kid from California, collapsed beside him. "Man, what's Thompson's problem?" Tommy wheezed, wiping sweat from his face with his sleeve. "It's like he's got it out for you, specifically." Jake nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing. Every time I turn around, he's there with some new impossible task or criticism. Yesterday he made me clean the barracks bathroom with a toothbrush because I supposedly didn't fold my shirts correctly." "That's insane," Tommy replied, shaking his head. "My cousin went through basic at Paris Island, and he said drill instructors were tough. But this seems excessive." The truth was, Jake had noticed something troubling about Thompson's training methods. While the other officers pushed their recruits hard but fairly, Thompson seemed to cross lines that made Jake uncomfortable. He'd seen the lieutenant make recruits do push-ups until they collapsed, deny water breaks during sweltering heat, and use verbal abuse that went beyond normal military discipline. Just last week, Jake had witnessed Thompson force a recruit named Danny Williams to continue an obstacle course despite the young man clearly suffering from heat exhaustion. Williams had eventually collapsed and needed medical attention. But Thompson had shown no remorse, claiming the recruit was weak and unfit for military service. During weapons training that afternoon, Jake found himself paired with Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the more approachable non-commissioned officers on base. Rodriguez was a career soldier with 15 years of experience, and unlike Thompson, he seemed genuinely interested in helping the recruits succeed. "You look troubled, Martinez," Rodriguez observed as they cleaned their rifles after the shooting exercise. "Something eating at you?" Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should voice his concerns. Military protocol demanded respect for superior officers, but his conscience was bothering him more each day. "Sergeant, can I ask you something?" Jake finally said, his voice low enough that nearby recruits couldn't hear. "Is Lieutenant Thompson's training style normal? Some of the things I've seen seem a bit extreme." Rodriguez's expression grew serious. He glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard before responding. "What specifically are you referring to?" "Private?" Jake described the incident with Williams and several other examples of what he considered excessive punishment. Rodriguez listened carefully, his face growing more concerned with each detail. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention," Rodriguez said finally. "The military is tough by design, but safety should never be compromised. Have you considered speaking with Thompson directly about your concerns?" "Honestly, Sergeant, I don't think that would go well," Jake replied. "He already seems to have it out for me. I'm afraid confronting him would just make things worse." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your position, but sometimes direct communication is the best approach. Thompson is your immediate superior, and military protocol suggests addressing concerns up the chain of command when appropriate." That evening, as Jake lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the conversation with Rodriguez from his mind. The sergeant's advice made sense from a military perspective, but Jake knew that challenging a superior officer could have serious consequences for his career. At the same time, he couldn't continue watching fellow recruits suffer under what he believed was abusive treatment. The next morning brought another grueling training session, this time focused on hand-to-hand combat techniques. Thompson prowled among the pairs of sparring recruits like a predator, offering harsh criticism and demanding they fight with increasing intensity. "You're all moving like you're afraid of getting hurt," Thompson bellowed. "In real combat, hesitation will get you killed. Fight like your lives depend on it." Jake was paired with a larger recruit named Marcus Johnson, a former football player from Texas who outweighed him by at least 40 pounds. The two young men circled each other cautiously, following the techniques they'd been taught while trying to avoid serious injury. "Harder!" Thompson shouted, stepping closer to their match. "Johnson, hit him like you mean it. Martinez, stop dancing around like a ballerina." As the intensity increased, Jake began to notice that Thompson was pushing this particular exercise beyond reasonable limits. Several recruits had already sustained minor injuries, but the lieutenant showed no signs of calling a halt to the training. The breaking point came when Tommy Chen, Jake's friend from California, was matched against a much larger opponent. The size difference was dramatic, and it quickly became apparent that Tommy was in over his head. His opponent landed a solid punch to Tommy's midsection, doubling him over and leaving him gasping for breath. "Get up, Chen," Thompson commanded. "You think the enemy is going to give you time to catch your breath?" Tommy struggled to his feet, still clearly winded from the blow. His face was pale, and Jake could see that his friend was in no condition to continue fighting. "Sir," Jake called out, stepping forward despite the breach of protocol. "I think Private Chen needs a moment to recover." Thompson's head snapped toward Jake, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Did I ask for your opinion, Martinez?" "No, sir, but—" "Then keep your mouth shut and focus on your own performance," Thompson interrupted. "Chen, continue the exercise. Now." Jake watched in horror as Tommy was forced to continue sparring despite his obvious distress. After another minute of punishment, his friend finally collapsed completely, his legs giving out beneath him. This time, Thompson couldn't ignore the situation, and he reluctantly called for medical assistance. As the medics examined Tommy, Jake felt his anger boiling over. This had gone too far, and he could no longer stand by and watch Thompson's reckless disregard for the recruit's safety. "Lieutenant Thompson," Jake said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence of the training area. "I need to speak with you." Thompson turned slowly, his face a mask of cold fury. "What did you say? Private?" Jake's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stand straight and maintain eye contact. "I said I need to speak with you, sir. About your training methods." A collective intake of breath swept through the gathered recruits. Everyone knew that directly challenging a superior officer was a serious breach of military protocol, one that could result in severe disciplinary action or even discharge from the service. Thompson took several steps closer to Jake, stopping just inches from the young recruit's face. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Private Martinez, you are walking on very thin ice. I suggest you think carefully about what you say next." But Jake had already crossed the line, and there was no turning back now. "Sir, with all due respect, I believe your training methods are putting recruits at unnecessary risk. What happened to Private Chen could have been prevented if proper safety protocols had been followed." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake could feel the eyes of every person on the training ground focused on him, waiting to see what would happen next. Thompson's face had gone completely white, and for a moment, Jake wondered if the lieutenant might actually strike him. Instead, Thompson spoke in a voice so quiet that only Jake could hear. "Private Martinez, you have just made the biggest mistake of your military career. Report to my office at 0600 hours tomorrow morning." Dismissed. As Thompson stalked away, Jake remained standing at attention, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just done. He had challenged a superior officer in front of the entire training unit, and there would undoubtedly be consequences. But as he looked over at Tommy Chen being helped to his feet by the medics, Jake felt a sense of satisfaction that he'd finally spoken up for what he believed was right. The other recruits dispersed slowly, many of them shooting Jake looks that ranged from admiration to pity. He knew that word of the confrontation would spread quickly through the base, and by morning, everyone would know that Private Jake Martinez had stood up to Lieutenant Thompson. That night, Jake barely slept. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, wondering what Thompson had planned for him and whether he'd just destroyed his military career before it had even begun. But despite his anxiety about the future, he didn't regret his decision. Sometimes, he reflected, doing the right thing required taking a stand, regardless of the personal cost. Jake arrived at Lieutenant Thompson's office at precisely 0600 hours, his uniform immaculate and his mind prepared for whatever punishment awaited him. The administrative building was quiet in the early morning hours, with only the sound of his boots echoing through the empty corridors. Thompson's office was spartanly furnished, with a simple metal desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets lining one wall. What caught Jake's attention, however, were the numerous certificates and commendations hanging on the walls. Though he was too far away to read the details, Thompson sat behind his desk, reviewing paperwork without acknowledging Jake's presence. "Private Martinez reporting as ordered, sir," Jake announced, standing at rigid attention. Thompson continued reading for another 30 seconds before finally looking up. His expression was unreadable, a stark contrast to the fury Jake had expected. "Sit down, Martinez," Thompson said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We need to have a conversation." Jake sat carefully, maintaining his military posture while trying to gauge Thompson's mood. The lieutenant leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with an intensity that made the young recruit uncomfortable. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Thompson asked, his voice calm but carrying an underlying tension. "Sir, I spoke up when I believed a fellow soldier was in danger," Jake replied steadily. Thompson nodded slowly. "And, in doing so, you violated military protocol, challenged a superior officer in front of your peers, and undermined unit discipline. Any one of those infractions could result in your immediate discharge from the service." Jake felt his stomach drop, but he forced himself to remain composed. "I understand the consequences of my actions, sir. Do you?" Thompson stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the training grounds where recruits were already beginning their morning exercises. "Tell me, Martinez, what do you think military training is supposed to accomplish?" The question caught Jake off guard. He had expected a straightforward disciplinary proceeding, not a philosophical discussion. "Sir, military training prepares soldiers for combat situations, builds unit cohesion, and instills the discipline necessary for effective service," Jake answered, reciting what he'd learned in orientation. Thompson turned back to face him. "That's the textbook answer. But what about the reality of combat? What happens when bullets start flying and men are dying around you? How do you think soldiers develop the mental toughness to function in those conditions?" Jake sensed that Thompson was leading somewhere with these questions, but he couldn't figure out the lieutenant's angle. "I understand that training needs to be challenging, sir," Jake said carefully. "But I believe there's a difference between pushing soldiers to their limits and putting them in unnecessary danger." Something flickered across Thompson's face, surprise, perhaps, or even respect. He returned to his desk and pulled out a thick file folder. "Your performance evaluations are actually quite good, Martinez," Thompson said, flipping through the papers. "High marks in marksmanship, physical fitness, and tactical knowledge. Your instructors consistently note your leadership potential and moral character." Jake remained silent, unsure where this conversation was headed. "But there's something else in here," Thompson continued, pulling out a single sheet of paper. "A psychological evaluation that notes your tendency to question authority when you perceive injustice. The evaluator recommended close monitoring to determine whether this trait would be an asset or a liability." The lieutenant set the paper aside and fixed Jake with a penetrating stare. "Yesterday, you made that determination for us." "Sir?" Thompson stood again, this time walking to one of the framed certificates on the wall. "Tell me, Martinez, what do you see when you look at me?" Jake hesitated, unsure how to answer such a personal question. "Sir," I see my commanding officer. Look deeper, Thompson commanded. What else do you see? Jake studied the lieutenant more carefully. Thompson's posture was ramrod straight, his movements precise and economical. There were small scars on his hands, and a thin white line along his left temple that Jake hadn't noticed before. Most telling were the lieutenant's eyes. They held a depth of experience that seemed inconsistent with his apparent age and rank. I see someone with combat experience, sir, Jake said slowly. Thompson nodded approvingly. Very good. What you see is someone who learned the hard way that the difference between life and death in combat often comes down to split-second decisions made under extreme stress. The lieutenant moved to another frame on the wall, this one containing what appeared to be a group photograph of soldiers in desert camouflage. I've been in this man's army for 26 years, Martinez. I've served in conflicts most people have never heard of, in places that don't officially exist on any map. I've seen good soldiers die because they weren't properly prepared for the realities of war. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Thompson's voice had taken on a quality he'd never heard before, not the harsh bark of a drill instructor, but the quiet intensity of someone who had witnessed terrible things. Every training method I employ has been tested in actual combat situations, Thompson continued. The stress positions, the verbal pressure, the physical demands, they're all designed to simulate the psychological and physiological conditions soldiers face in battle. But what about Private Chen? Jake asked, unable to stop himself. He could have been seriously injured. Thompson turned back to face him. And for a moment, Jake saw something vulnerable in the older man's expression. Chen was never in real danger, Thompson said quietly. I've been monitoring every recruit's condition throughout training. The moment his vital signs indicated genuine distress, the exercise would have been stopped. But Chen needed to learn that he could push beyond what he thought were his limits. Jake felt confused and slightly off balance. This didn't match the narrative he'd constructed in his mind about Thompson's motivations. I don't understand, sir. If you were monitoring the situation, why did you react so strongly when I spoke up? Thompson returned to his desk and sat down heavily. Because, Private Martinez, you did something very dangerous yesterday. You undermined unit discipline and questioned my authority in front of your peers. In a combat situation, that kind of behavior could get people killed. The lieutenant paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision before continuing. But you also did something very important. You stood up for a fellow soldier when you believed he was in danger. Despite the personal cost to yourself. That's a quality that's rarer than you might think. Jake sat in stunned silence, trying to process this unexpected turn in the conversation. Thompson opened a desk drawer and pulled out another file. This one much thinner than Jake's personnel record. There's something you need to understand about military service, Martinez. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on the battlefield, but in moments when someone chooses to do what's right, despite the consequences. The lieutenant slid a single photograph across the desk. It showed a much younger Thompson in combat gear, standing with a group of soldiers in what appeared to be a Middle Eastern desert. This was taken in Iraq, during my third deployment, Thompson said softly. I was a sergeant then, leading a squad in some of the heaviest fighting of the war. The man standing next to me in that photo was my commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison. Jake studied the photograph, noting the obvious bond between the soldiers captured in the image. Harrison was one of the best officers I ever served under, Thompson continued. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, and his men would have followed him anywhere. But during one particular mission, things went very wrong. Thompson's voice grew distant, as if he were reliving events from long ago. We were conducting a search operation in a hostile village when we came under heavy fire. Harrison was wounded in the initial attack, but he insisted on continuing to lead the unit despite his injuries. I could see that he was in no condition to make tactical decisions, but military protocol demanded that I follow his orders. Jake felt a growing sense of unease about where this story was leading. For 20 minutes, I followed Harrison's increasingly erratic commands while our situation deteriorated. Finally, I made a choice that I knew could end my career. I relieved him of command and took charge of the squad myself. The lieutenant met Jake's eyes across the desk. That decision saved the lives of 8 men, including Harrison himself. but it also meant that I had directly disobeyed a superior officer in a combat zone, which is one of the most serious offenses in military law. What happened? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I was court-martialed, Thompson replied matter-of-factly. The proceedings lasted 6 months, during which time my military career hung in the balance. Ultimately, the tribunal determined that my actions were justified given the circumstances, but the controversy effectively ended my chances for promotion beyond company-grade officer rank. Jake stared at the photograph, beginning to understand the full implications of what Thompson had just revealed. That's why you're still a lieutenant after 26 years of service, Jake said. Thompson nodded grimly. I chose to do what I believed was right, instead of what was militarily correct. It cost me my career advancement, but it saved the lives of my men. Some people would call that a fair trade. The office fell silent as Jake absorbed this revelation. Everything he thought he knew about Lieutenant Thompson was shifting, revealing a far more complex picture than he had imagined. Why are you telling me this, sir? Jake finally asked. Thompson leaned forward, his expression intense. Because yesterday, you faced the same choice I did all those years ago. You chose to speak up for what you believed was right, despite the potential consequences to your own career. That tells me something important about your character. Jake felt a mixture of confusion and growing respect for the man sitting across from him. I still don't understand your training methods, sir. I'm not asking you to understand them yet, Thompson replied. But I am asking you to trust that everything I do has a purpose. The soldiers who complete my training program have the highest survival rates of any unit in the Army. That's not an accident. The lieutenant stood up, signaling that the meeting was drawing to a close. You're not in trouble, Martinez. In fact, I'm recommending you for advanced leadership training. But I need you to understand something very clearly. Jake rose to attention, his mind reeling from everything he'd heard. Military service sometimes requires making impossible choices between competing loyalties, Thompson said. Yesterday, you proved that you have the moral courage to make those choices. Now I need to teach you how to make them wisely. As Jake left the office, his head was spinning with questions and revelations. The man he had thought was a harsh, uncaring officer had just revealed himself to be something far more complex. A veteran who had sacrificed his own career advancement to save the lives of his men. But Jake sensed that Thompson's story was far from complete. The certificates and commendations on the office walls suggested a military record much more distinguished than what the lieutenant had revealed. As Jake walked back to the barracks, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of Lieutenant Thompson's true history. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's confrontation with Lieutenant Thompson, and the dynamic between them had shifted in ways he never could have anticipated. Thompson's training remained demanding, but Jake began to notice subtleties he had missed before: the careful way the lieutenant monitored each recruit's physical condition, the strategic timing of rest breaks, and the psychological techniques designed to build confidence rather than break spirits. Jake was walking past the base library one afternoon when he spotted Sergeant Rodriguez sitting at a computer terminal. The sergeant looked up as Jake approached, a knowing smile crossing his face. Martinez, just the person I wanted to see, Rodriguez said, gesturing to an empty chair nearby. I've been doing some research since our conversation about Lieutenant Thompson. Jake sat down, curious about what Rodriguez had discovered. The sergeant's expression was a mixture of excitement and amazement. I had a hunch that there was more to Thompson's story than he was letting on, Rodriguez explained, turning the computer monitor so Jake could see the screen. So, I started digging through some old military databases and archived news articles. The screen displayed a newspaper article dated 15 years earlier, with the headline, Army Ranger receives Medal of Honor for heroic action in Afghanistan. Below the headline was a photograph that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. The image showed a younger Lieutenant Thompson, his uniform torn and blood-stained, standing at attention as a general pinned a medal to his chest. The caption read, Lieutenant Michael Thompson receives the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism during Operation Mountain Strike. That's impossible, Jake whispered, staring at the photograph. He told me his career was ruined by that court-martial. Rodriguez scrolled down to reveal more of the article. Read this, Martinez. It's incredible. Jake read aloud from the screen. Lieutenant Thompson's squad was conducting a reconnaissance mission in the Hindu Kush Mountains when they were ambushed by a superior force of enemy fighters. Despite being heavily outnumbered and cut off from reinforcement, Thompson led a counterattack that lasted 14 hours and resulted in the rescue of 23 civilians being held hostage in a nearby village. Rodriguez pulled up another article, this one from a military journal. There's more. Look at this. The second article detailed Thompson's entire military career, revealing a record of service that read like something from a Hollywood movie. Multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, numerous decorations for valor, and a reputation among special forces units as one of the most effective small unit commanders in the Army. But why didn't he tell me any of this? Jake asked, confused by the discrepancy between Thompson's modest account of his career and the heroic record displayed on the screen. Keep reading, Rodriguez said, clicking to a third article. This one was dated just 2 years after the Medal of Honor ceremony and carried the headline, Decorated Army Officer Faces Court-Martial After Disobeying Orders. Jake read the article with growing understanding. Thompson had indeed been court-martialed for relieving his commanding officer, just as he had told Jake. But the article revealed additional details that Thompson had omitted from his story. Listen to this, Jake said, reading from the screen. The court-martial proceedings revealed that Lieutenant Thompson had repeatedly requested permission to evacuate his wounded commander, but was ordered to continue the mission despite the officer's deteriorating condition. Thompson's decision to assume command potentially prevented a military disaster that could have resulted in significant American casualties. Rodriguez nodded grimly. The article goes on to say that while Thompson was technically found guilty of disobeying a direct order, the military tribunal recommended leniency based on the extraordinary circumstances and his previous exemplary record. So his career wasn't destroyed, Jake said slowly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Not exactly, Rodriguez replied, scrolling to yet another document. But something else happened that explains why he's been stuck at the lieutenant level for so long. The new document was an internal Army memo discussing Thompson's reassignment following the court-martial. Jake read it with growing astonishment. According to this, Thompson was offered promotion to major and a prestigious assignment at the Pentagon, Jake said. But he turned it down? Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. That's right. He specifically requested assignment to basic training units, with a focus on preparing new recruits for combat deployment. Jake stared at the screen, trying to reconcile this information with his previous assumptions about Thompson's motivations. There's one more thing you need to see, Rodriguez said, pulling up a final document. This one was a commendation letter, written by a 4-star general, praising Thompson's contributions to military training programs. Jake read the letter aloud. Lieutenant Thompson's innovative training methods have resulted in a 40% reduction in combat casualties among soldiers who completed his programs. His unique approach to psychological preparation and stress inoculation has become a model for training units throughout the Army. The full picture was beginning to emerge, and Jake felt a growing sense of awe and embarrassment about his initial judgment of Thompson. He's been saving lives this entire time, Jake said quietly. Every harsh training exercise, every seemingly impossible demand, it's all been designed to prepare recruits for survival in actual combat. Rodriguez nodded. The man you challenged 3 weeks ago isn't just some tough drill instructor, Martinez. He's a legitimate military legend who chose to sacrifice his own career advancement to train the next generation of soldiers. That evening, Jake found himself walking the base perimeter, his mind churning with everything he had learned. The revelations about Thompson's true background had forced him to reconsider not just the lieutenant's training methods, but his own understanding of military service and sacrifice. As he rounded a corner near the training facilities, Jake spotted a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench overlooking the parade ground. Lieutenant Thompson sat in the gathering twilight, still in uniform despite the late hour. Jake approached cautiously, unsure whether he should disturb Thompson's solitude. The lieutenant looked up as Jake drew near, showing no surprise at the interruption. "Evening, Martinez," Thompson said simply. "Can't sleep?" "Too much thinking, sir," Jake replied, stopping a respectful distance away. Thompson gestured to the empty space on the bench beside him. Thinking can be dangerous for a soldier. Mind sharing what's keeping you awake? Jake sat down carefully, still processing his newfound knowledge about the man beside him. Sir, I've learned some things about your background that I didn't know before. Thompson's expression didn't change. Is that so? And what exactly have you learned? I know about the Medal of Honor, Jake said quietly. I know about your combat record. And I know about the real reason you've stayed in training command instead of accepting promotion. Thompson was silent for a long moment, gazing out at the empty parade ground where so many young recruits had taken their first steps toward becoming soldiers. I was wondering when you'd figure that out, Thompson finally said. Rodriguez has been making inquiries. I'm surprised it took him this long to put the pieces together. Why didn't you tell me the whole truth when we talked in your office? Jake asked. Thompson turned to face him, and in the fading light, Jake could see the weight of years and experiences etched in the older man's features. Because the details of my combat record aren't what's important, Martinez. What matters is what I learned from those experiences and how I can use that knowledge to keep young soldiers alive. The lieutenant stood up and walked to the edge of the parade ground, his hands clasped behind his back in a characteristic pose. Every soldier who passes through my training program is someone's son or daughter, Thompson continued. Every technique I teach, every physical and psychological challenge I present, is designed with one goal in mind: bringing those young people home, alive from whatever conflicts they may face. 1. Jake joined Thompson at the edge of the parade ground, finally beginning to understand the full scope of the lieutenant's dedication. You could have had a comfortable Pentagon assignment, Jake observed. Why choose this instead? Thompson smiled for the first time since Jake had known him. Because this is where I can make the biggest difference. A staff officer in Washington might influence policy, but a training instructor shapes the soldiers who actually implement that policy in the field. And the court-martial? Do you ever regret that decision? Every difficult choice leaves scars, Martinez, Thompson replied. But I've never regretted putting the lives of my men ahead of my own career prospects. That's what leadership really means, accepting personal cost to protect those under your command. Jake felt a profound shift in his understanding, not just of Thompson, but of military service itself. The lieutenant's willingness to sacrifice personal advancement for the welfare of others represented an ideal of service that went beyond duty or obligation. Sir, I owe you an apology, Jake said. I misjudged your methods and your motivations. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment. Thompson placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. Your instinct to protect a fellow soldier was correct, Martinez. Never apologize for that. But you're learning that military leadership requires balancing multiple competing priorities, mission accomplishment, unit welfare, and individual safety among them. As they walked back toward the barracks, Thompson shared more of his philosophy about military training and leadership. Jake listened intently, recognizing that he was receiving mentorship from someone whose experience and wisdom far exceeded anything he had initially recognized. There's something else you should understand about my decision to stay in training command, Thompson said as they reached the entrance to the administrative building. It's not a permanent assignment. I'm being considered for promotion to colonel and a command position in the 82nd Airborne Division. Jake stopped walking, surprised by this revelation. You're leaving? Thompson nodded. Within the next 6 months, most likely. But before I go, I want to ensure that the soldiers I've trained are ready for whatever challenges they may face. Including me? Jake asked. Especially you, Thompson replied. You've demonstrated leadership potential and moral courage. With the right development, you could become the kind of officer this army needs. As Jake lay in his bunk that night, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this point. 3 weeks earlier, he had seen Thompson as a harsh, uncaring officer whose training methods bordered on abusive. Now he understood that he had been in the presence of a military legend, a man whose dedication to developing capable, resilient soldiers had saved countless lives over the years. The confrontation that Jake had feared would end his military career had instead opened a door to mentorship and growth he never could have imagined. As he drifted off to sleep, Jake found himself looking forward to the remaining months of training with Lieutenant Thompson, knowing that every lesson would be taught by someone who truly understood the cost of warfare and the value of proper preparation. In the darkness of the barracks, Jake smiled as he realized that sometimes the most important lessons come from questioning our initial assumptions and remaining open to the possibility that there's always more to someone's story than meets the eye. Lieutenant Thompson had taught him that true military leadership isn't about power or authority, but about the willingness to sacrifice personal advancement for the welfare of others, a lesson that would guide Jake throughout his own military career.